Welcome to Dolby Creator Talks. This is a show about how artists use technology to tell their stories, and I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. We're continuing our conversations on the groundbreaking sound work in the world of gaming with senior members of the sound team behind Helldivers 2. After 8 years of development, Helldivers 2 became one of the most critically acclaimed and commercially successful games released last year, receiving high praise for its incredible soundtrack from gamers and critics alike. So today we're joined once again by my colleague at Dolby, Alistair Hirst, in conversation with the sound team behind Helldivers 2. Here's Alistair.
I'm here today with some of the members of the team that did the audio for Helldivers 2, which is a game that's set in the 22nd century. The story follows the Helldivers, an elite force of shock troops who are dispatched to combat various threats to humanity. So I'd like to introduce some of the members of that team. We have Harvey Scott, who's the project audio director, Juuso Tolvanen, the project lead sound designer, Paulo Velasquez, the senior dialogue designer, Simon Gumbleton, the senior technical sound design supervisor, and from Arrowhead Game Studios, we have Oliver Anderson. Cool. So Helldivers 2 is obviously a sequel. Maybe you can tell us a bit about the history of the development of Helldivers 2.
As you may or may not know, there was an original Helldivers title released many moons ago, I think 2016, correct me if I'm wrong. That was a very different beast, really. It was a top-down PvE shooter, much in the same way that Helldivers 2 is, but I guess the key difference there is it was top-down, and so some of the requirements for gameplay are, significantly changed, and aesthetic, I suppose, is a significant change there. So, that came out 2016, and then since then, up until release at some point, Arrowhead had been developing the sequel, and with it, a shift in perspective down to a third-person perspective on the ground, sort of in amongst the battle, as opposed to looking at it from above. Yeah, really changing the requirements for, definitely, at least for the audio experience.
So how big was the audio team at the various stages of development?
It really peaked towards the end, like many games being developed, like it would tend to balloon towards the end of development. So, at our peak, we had ourselves, Arrowhead joining in with their sound designers and audio programmers and other members of the Arrowhead team. We've got, from our side, we have obviously our sound designers, technical sound designers, dialogue designers. We've got a music team internally as well that worked on that. And many other departments that I'm obviously missing out on, QA, localization, you name it. So it gets really quite big towards the end. But yeah, I suppose, towards the beginning of development, from humble beginnings, probably prior to your time in the project, Oliver, I think it would have been a much smaller team, actually. So yeah, at least in this case, we ended up with a typically fairly large support team from Sony side collaborating with Arrowhead towards the end. And yeah, that saw us through to the release. Generally in the
similar time zones, though?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we didn't say. So most of us are currently based in the UK, like we're in London at the moment. And then Arrowhead in Stockholm, Sweden, is only an hour's time difference. So conveniently, that lets us collaborate remotely or not, which is handy. But yeah, we also had some of our team members out in the US, which was, I guess another time zone. I'm trying to think, did we miss out any other time zones there? Finland as well. We had some of our sound designers out in Finland. So yeah, there's a smattering across the world,
right.
Which, yeah, it goes pretty well these days. I feel like it's becoming pretty standard practice to have access to, people around the world like that.
So in terms of the creative vision for the project, what were the audio design direction pillars?
Sure, that's a great question. So I think towards the beginning, when we were first collaborating with Arrowhead, we spoke with their creative direction, about kind of what their vision was and, how we could aid in providing that. Words that came up quite a lot were visceral, sort of viscerality. So as you can imagine, chaotic, fairly violent game like Helldivers, there's a certain aesthetic that lends itself to the visual quality, the qualities of the visuals. I think Yuso, like amongst you and I, when we're kind of doing asset content review and talking about general aesthetics, over the top movie trailer style sound effects, I guess, is one sort of aspect of where we were trying to lead things. It's just
when I joined the project, I think there were still some ideas of kind of emphasizing the that is kind of like a shabby equipment. It's not necessarily like super pristine. These are like masses of soldiers, and maybe they're giving a little bit like subpar equipment. And I guess we tried to experiment with that in the audio side of things for a while, but it kind of took away from kind of just the player satisfaction and how hard hitting we can make these things. So we opted for the more cinematic feel, I think.
Yeah, grounded where possible, I suppose, is maybe another way of saying that. But if not, larger than life, over the top, in your face kind of action inspired.
Did you take any design cues from the first Helldivers, or was this a complete reimagining?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. We looked at the original game as the thing to pay homage to where possible, but really quite radical change in art style and gameplay from top down, where everything looks a little bit more miniature, has a different sort of expectation. Your brain is kind of expecting something different, essentially. That really dictated quite a radical shift in the sound design. But there were, we did try to pay homage to some of the aspects of the second game that like rhymed with the first game. So, we've got the automaton robot enemies in the second game, which are related to the cyborgs of the first, but not identical. So, we had some discussions about how to potentially include aspects of them in the sequel. But for the most part, there was a recognition that we needed really full spectrum sound design, content that filled the space that was otherwise not necessarily needed in the original top-down view, where things seemed sort of smaller on screen, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think for the bot enemies, our sound designer Edward Durkin did use the sounds from the first game and mangled them and excuse me, kind of enhanced them and took them a little like a step further for the second game. So I think we tried to reuse some assets here and there.
Requesting orbital.
Requesting sentry. Calling in reinforcement.
So kind of beef them up for the closer perspective.
Yeah, I think he did quite a lot of like mangling to it. So, but
yeah, the original source is in there somewhere, but it's processed to the extent where maybe you can't recognize it. Yeah.
I actually remember the original source. It's like a blend of Swedish and Finnish gibberish, basically. I think it was recorded in Arrowhead's old studio before we moved to our current location. I think it's someone's husband or something. Yeah, it's really cool.
It's kind of funny. I see people post online that they recognize like some of the sentences in there, but I don't know if this is a massive spoiler, but I guess it's not there.
Yeah.
So with a distributed team like that, how did you keep them all unified on that vision that you're going for, and keep everyone on the same page?
The key thing is obviously making sure the team feels like it's together, and we're all focused on the same mission over the months leading up to release. But yeah, crucially, I think having a reliable form of review of everybody's work, and really just making sure that things are hitting the right bar, and that we're iterating concepts, but also ultimately what matters is how it behaves in game. So there was a lot of review taking place, which I think you and I, that ended up taking up sometimes the majority of our days, was just reviewing incoming content, making sure that it was approved for use in game, and then similarly looking at the behaviors of the systems that are playing back that content in game as well. So yeah, I think it's a combination of just making sure that everybody's on the same page as a team together, as well as just reviewing that content just to make sure everything's in line with the vision and the expected quality, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that also came with like playtesting. We did like weekly playtesting sessions, so it was pretty thorough with that. So just you just gotta feel it in action and in context with all the other, if it's like stratagems, all the other explosions going on. You don't want one to be weaker than the other, so you get a pretty good overview like that.
So can you give us kind of a high level idea of the scope of the audio? How big was this game when it came to the audio assets?
I couldn't give you a specific number. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but I mean, we had, I'm tempted to say, like almost maybe 24 different weapons at launch. I mean, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, something approaching that, and then maybe 6 different enemy types per faction. So there was a fair amount in terms of content for sure. And then obviously all the other areas, we had, countless planets, ambience types, cinematics, scripted moments in the tutorial, haptic design as well, which is also on our plate for the PS5 DualSense controller. So, not to mention music, dialogue, obviously Paula taking care of the dialogue there. So yeah, it was a large amount of content, similar to most titles of that size, really, ultimately.
So how did you distribute that work amongst the team? Was there specific, did some locations focus on specific areas of the game, or how did that work?
We tried to split our team up into areas of ownership. We actually called those pillars, maybe confusingly. So there were, I think maybe 8 pillars altogether, something along those lines. So that includes, somebody owning ambience as a whole, somebody owning weapons, enemies, haptics, or tech. Simon here on the call was looking after that pillar. And then, within that, we would keep sort of one lead and then people working under or reporting to that person as a sort of general team structure, which worked pretty well. It helps to delegate out that work across the team and sort of, put your trust in your team to just execute the work for their specific areas. And just allow people to immerse themselves in those specific areas, if that makes sense.
So did you have time to do any field recordings or studio recordings for this game?
Did we do field recordings? I'm trying to think, did anything make it in specifically?
I don't remember. I don't think, not like a big session at least.
Yeah. I think that, maybe that's worth discussing quickly as well, that sometimes there's a trade-off of time needed to invest in something like field recording versus time, and budget that actually exists. So often is the case, especially luckily we're working for Sony, who have, a large internal library and resources available, across the whole history of different titles that we've worked on. So it's rare that we'll always try to, obtain original source as much as possible if the time allows. But ultimately, if it's bigger bang for buck to go in and actually just sort of execute on the various tasks that get the sound into the game, rather than go out, and field record. That's often the right thing to do, depending on the team size, budget, etc. So in this case, we didn't do a ton. But certainly recording with dialogue was a major thing, which we can probably chat about later with Paula. But certainly for field recording, not that much. Yeah.
I don't know, Oliver, if you did any recordings on your side or in the studio, or
I feel like pillar owners were kind of facilitating their own source in a lot of ways as well, which is something we keep seeing in the live part of the game. So people will use original recordings, but it's often sourced personally. I find myself using a lot of things I record on the buy to buy, I guess.
In terms of sound design, now that we're working on the latest generation of consoles that are more powerful, I'm curious if you had any real-time DSP effects that you're using as opposed to baking in your effects into the sounds themselves. Was there much of that going on?
There was a fair amount. I think there was a lot that was aiding the mix. So, we'll have kind of standard mix tools available, DSP, so compression for dynamics control, happening where we're summing all of our different sounds together at a bus level, essentially. So that's a kind of standard approach. Same with things like EQ where necessary, and then a mastering suite as part of that pipeline to the output. But yeah, I don't know, Paola, did you want to maybe discuss some of the real-time dialogue processing systems that we had in the game?
Yeah, that was also another thing that we had to work with in terms of VO, because if you play the game, you know that a lot of the dialogue in the game, it's actually futzed. So that means all the VO that's coming through for the Helldivers, for example, that's coming through their helmet, or the radio comms and stuff like that, it's being futzed. So originally the brief was to bake in this into each asset. However, this on top of every single line that is being recorded not only for English, but all the other languages that's being localized to, it creates quite a bit of overhead. So the way we decided to do it was to just create runtime effects for each and every one of the Helldivers helmet effects, and also for all the radio comms and stuff like that. And each one of the characters had its own different effect. This allowed players to just identify the characters better, and just gave it a bit of a different flavor and character.
Another one bites the dust. New mag. Have a taste of democracy. How'd you like to taste of freedom?
ETA T-minus 3 minutes.
Big part of the gameplay is the stratagems, which for people who haven't played is powerful equipment which you can call in from orbit to help out during battles. I'm curious, how did you approach those sounds? How did you make sure that each one was unique and, was communicating, the kind of thing that it was doing?
We looked at the stratagems in a kind of multi-stage approach, I suppose. Like there's the deployment coming down from space, which lends itself to a certain degree of hyping up, if you like, as it's incoming. You've got just standard equipment coming down in a pod, then your standard deployment, but something like a shell being fired from outer space presents some sort of pre-explosion ramp up to sort of generate some degree of hype, which is obviously larger than life style of sound design. But yeah, I mean, Yuso, can you think of any stratagem related interesting things?
Yeah, I think like for the variety of sounds that we got, I think that's where kind of having the amount of sound designers that we had was very useful, because then you would have different designers doing basically the same area. So, naturally you would just get variation on everybody's different style. So those really kind of played well together, because it's quite tough. Like once you've done one explosion, like how do you do it again in a very different way? So that was definitely one of the ways to make it more interesting. Trying to think if there was anything else. I guess we tried to, at least personally, I tried to steer away from the cliches like too much. I think we had like a Gatling barrage things, and usually people expect those to just kind of go like brrr, but we tried to do something more interesting. But yeah.
I suppose maybe one thing to note there as well is we tried to create a somewhat of a tiered system in terms of what was allowed to, and this is more of a mix related thing, but what was allowed to get the loudest, and so work our way backwards from there, where the most powerful or what would need to feel the most powerful stratagem was usually the loudest. And so that again helps to create some degree of variety and expectation of power. When it sounds loud, it is loud for a reason. It's powerful.
Sending in an eagle. Here comes the cavalry.
I imagine one of the most fun things to work on for sound design for this game, at least from my perspective, was the different enemies that you had. How did you approach that in terms of source and overall design direction?
Well, we shipped with two different enemy factions, so within there's complete polar opposites of sound design requirements. You've got the bugs, the terminids, and then the mechanical automatons, robots, basically. As you can imagine, those two things really present quite a nice contrast against each other. So for the bugs in general, we try to approach that as you can imagine, a creature-based approach. A lot of vocalizations. I think for the most part, the character from those enemies comes directly from their vocalizations. Most of the time, if they're attacking, you're going to have an associated vocalization. Likewise, if they're just patrolling, like that's what really identifies them. I suppose you can contrast that against the bots, where for the most part, when they're attacking, it's not about the vocalizations. It's about a lot of these momentary, transient weapon firing moments, right? So there's a lot of ballistic style weapons which don't feature in the terminids. And I suppose as well, Oliver, I don't know if you wanted to quickly discuss the Illuminate design that's now gone in post-launch.
Where we have the industrialism with bots and the kind of dry goriness of bugs. Illuminate really comes in with like a pristine set of sounds, so that really allowed us to just go all out on sci-fi things, where the other themes are a bit more grounded in those kind of things. So the thing I enjoy with all of these factions, though, that in what they have in common is like there is like no bar for what's too absurd for any of them. So you can have enemies in each faction that just takes out the curves for that theme. And for Illuminates, it was very much like clean plasma sci-fi style, but with a kind of clean edge on a lot of the vocalization works to give more space for all the kind of weapons and tech that they have.
Obviously, another big part of the game is the weapons. How did you approach the weapons and differentiating the different types from each other, and how complex were those?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I'm just sort of remembering towards the start of production, or our involvement at least, we tried to kind of take things too far for some of the ballistic sort of similar to weapons that we have in real life, right? And try to sort of see how sci-fi can we push it before it starts to feel kind of odd. And so we ended up settling what I would consider to be closer to a real life ballistic weapon for a lot of the assault rifles. And again, there is design intention from Arrowhead side for this to feel like it is a military sim style game in many ways. So there's only so far we could kind of stray for some of the more sort of traditional ballistic fire weapons. So there is a degree of realism, I suppose, in some of them. But certainly, yeah, they're beefed up, for lack of a better phrase, to feel larger than life. But there's plenty of opportunities outside of that for the imaginary technologies. So, there's ray gun weapons that obviously present themselves with different styles of sound design aesthetics. Yusa, I don't know if you wanted to discuss any of the content that you may have worked on.
I don't think I had too much on the weapons side, but I think, again, to go back to the playtesting topic, like that's where weapons, I think, came, like a lot of the iteration on the weapons came through just playing the game. These had to really withstand the test of time, and you had to be, able to spend hundreds of hours with these weapons. So there was a lot of iteration that just happened naturally over, a period of time.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think anything that started to, stand out as fatiguing or weak, became apparent over time compared to each other. That's another, I guess, interesting point is you really have to look at all the weapons together back to back to kind of figure out the ones that don't fit the picture, and sometimes that's not obvious just without that context. So certainly it's tricky sometimes to get that right.
Do you have an example of that from the game, like a specific weapon that stuck out, and what was it about that weapon that wasn't working?
I can't remember specifics. Like, it certainly happened more than once where over time you would just identify that this thing just doesn't feel as powerful as a shotgun compared to, some other weapon that was, supposed to be quite similar in terms of power level. And I suppose there's maybe that other psychological aspects to discuss there, which is often that will impact how the game, how players will perceive the actual effectiveness of a weapon, even if it has the same sort of statistics under the hood. It's doing the same damage. If it sounds weaker, people will be convinced that it is weaker. So if there's ever that feedback internally or externally from the players of the game, it's something to take really seriously, because it doesn't matter if you give that thing the highest stats in the game. If it sounds weaker than another weapon, no one is going to perceive that correctly, essentially.
I think one interesting thing was like you use the Liberator as kind of like a default, right? Mm-hmm. So that was kind of like the first one to be figured out, that this is the baseline, and then you would balance other weapons either like to be more powerful, or look at the stats and like, okay, this is going to kill it in one shot. It needs to be so much more visceral and powerful, and if it deals less damage, then it can be a little bit thinner in a way.
Let's turn to the mix. I got to say, it's an incredibly busy game, so I'm sure getting the mix right was quite a challenge, and I think you did a great job with that. When you play the mix, the sounds are coming across as being punchy, and you can hear the definition in the things that you are hearing. I'm just curious, how are you grouping the sounds in the mix, and how did you prioritize what was being heard moment to moment during those very busy battles?
So I think maybe the best place to kind of start on that is we tried to identify what was most important to the player at any one time, and try to structure our mix systems around that concept. So wherever possible, grouping things together based on importance to the player. I suppose
so let me interrupt you there, because this is something I've struggled with in some of the games, is what parameters from the game were you using to determine what was important to the player?
Sure. So there is a degree of dynamic determination on what is important to the player, but a lot of it you can map out without looking at, it can be applicable to any scenario. So you can kind of look at the game conceptually and go, okay, well, let's say the player is being actively shot, they're being damaged. That sound is probably the most important thing to hear, out of anything at any time, because as a player, your goal there is to survive and, kill more enemies than you are killed, essentially. So knowing that you're being damaged is a critical thing to know. And so you can map that at the top of a chart, no matter, what scenario. So there's certain sort of static anchor points, if you like, that make up the hierarchy of what's important initially. And then within that, we did have some things to let us know which enemy was a higher threat, for example. We'd have some systems there to specify a specific enemy and say, hey, this guy is the one that's trying to kill you. So accordingly, we can then increase that and say, hey, this guy is actually now the most important thing in the mix. So there are a few different examples like that in the game where we would dynamically determine that, if that makes sense.
Southeast.
So you're prioritizing these various things. What were you using to dynamically adjust those sounds in real time? What kind of systems were built in there?
We would take those priority values, if you like, and typically, rather than turn a sound up or down, it was actually more used to determine how much other sounds should move out of the way of that sound. So it was a sort of subtractive mix process, if you like, and then similarly, how much other sounds above that can duck that sound out of the way, essentially. So it goes both ways. It allows that sound to duck other things, but it also allows things that are more important than that sound to duck that sound out of the way. And I suppose as well, yeah, in some cases, we would also use that data parameters to potentially increase the volume or decrease the volume of those lower surrounding it. For some of the enemies, I believe we did that where, yeah, subtly, it's not like a huge difference, but it's enough to just help clean up the mix. A few dBs here and there. You'd move the lower threat value enemies out of the way for the one that's currently attacking you, for example.
Was there any dynamic EQ being applied during gameplay, or was it mostly volume that you're using to adjust?
We did a fair amount of dynamic EQ, I think where possible, in an attempt to make things more transparent. Sometimes just pushing the full spectrum down with volume alone can feel quite, brutal, maybe unnecessary, especially if you need to, you see an explosion, you still sort of want to feel at least some of that energy, hear it. So dynamic EQ is one such tool where you're only really carving out certain frequencies in favor of another sound effect rather than the full spectrum there, in an attempt to allow both sounds to be heard at once, to whatever degree is possible with masking.
So in terms of spatial audio, did you start mixing with spatial audio in mind, or how did that come about?
We knew that it was a possibility that we would need to support it. It's PS5 title, so there was some degree of looking at how we could best support it. And I think there was also the news towards the end of development that PS5 was going to support Atmos. So that was another sort of large, decision point to be made there. So we did consider the best way to output the game, like how we should support Atmos, how we should support 3D audio Tempest tech on PS5 as well. And so that informed, I suppose, a few mixed decisions, and I suppose leading us to asking questions about, well, what do we want to allow to be panned to the height speakers? How do we want that to interface with the 3D audio on PS5? What's the trade-off? How can we support both output formats in that sense?
So did you learn any sort of rules of thumb from that as you went through the mix of, what was working? Did you put everything up in the heights, just certain things? How did you approach that?
Something that became, or at least I suspected would be the case, was that using the heights, less is more. Try to reserve the moments for the height speakers for when it really counted. So rather than having perhaps everything that we could have possibly panned up there, it was more sort of saved for incoming projectiles above you or flying enemies, for example, things of that nature. So we certainly tried to think about how to best aid the feeling of height when you have the luxury of having height in your Atmos system. So there was also, we considered, I think we did end up doing this for the mix as well, increasing the volume for the height speakers just a little bit, not much, just to try to accent a sense of height where possible as well when actually playing over speakers, when we could determine that on PS5 and PC.
So some of the missions or parts of the missions were procedurally generated. Which parts, and did that affect how you mixed it all?
I think in terms of procedural generation, the thing that tends to impact most is ambience, environmental sounds. That becomes troublesome to manually populate the map, I suppose. Simon, I don't know if you have any anecdotes for some of the systems we had. I know that we had trouble with things like water placement or fire, even where that can be procedurally placed in the map, and so it becomes hard to have somebody go in and manually place up these elements in the map.
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of the levels were stitched together from these, what they called stamps, which were little kind of tiles, right? And there were a lot of them that would make up a particular biome, and a planet could be generated from any combination of these stamps stitched together. So manually going in and adding content only gets you so far. So I think we had systems for doing the ambient beds, for example, where we would each stamp knew kind of what category it was, or what kind of things it contained, or whether it was like dense with foliage or arid or whatever. And so the ambient beds were sort of driven by a combination of these variables stacking down from like global biome to like what's the current region that you're in, and what some information from the current stamp. So it gave the sound designers some flexibility to go in and add some stuff to specific stamps if they wanted to, but you could have pretty decent coverage of a generated planet just from the data. We had like reverbs as well. So we had like global planet reverbs, again, which is driven from some of that data about the biome. But we did build like reverb volumes that sound designers could place in the stamps if they wanted to have a special kind of reverb in a special zone. Water, trees, fire. These were kind of three really interesting problems in terms of ambiences and environments dealing with the procedural nature of them. We did have to end up building a few different systems that sort of used raycasts to try and detect where there was this dynamic water, for example, and try and build a set of emitters that roughly represented where the shoreline was. We did a similar thing with trees. So the level generation sort of had some information about where trees were, so you could get some information about the density of trees in a specific direction. So I think what we did is divided the space around the player into these quadrants, like front left, front right, rear left, rear right. And we then had, so this is dynamic, like as the player's running around, we're able to detect the density of trees in a given quadrant, and we're playing some ambience from a fixed point in that quadrant that is being driven in some way by the density of trees in that direction, which generates some nice kind of situations where you could be running through a forest and then leave the forest, and you'd have the clear soundscape in front of you and still the forest behind you, which was kind of nice. And we used the similar thing for fire in the end. Well, two types of fire. There was like static placed VFX, which again we did some work to allow sounds to be injected into the particles and played attached to the fire. And then you had dynamic fire, which again there was a system where we tried to detect around the player, like the density in some abstract way of the fire at different locations, and play like ambient streams, ambient one shots, or ambient loops around the player in this kind of grid, which kind of roughly represented the density of the fire in a space rather than just for a single point.
So it wasn't tied directly to the particle effects, or how were you identifying the fire or water graphic elements to tie the sound to?
Yeah, so in some cases, like you had particle effects where the VFX artist would go and place particles in a specific location. So like you would sometimes have these crashed vehicles in a stamp, and they would have static fire on them. So we then we added a system into the particle effect scripts to play back audio for those static particle effects automatically. So it meant, sound designers didn't have to go in and place them. But there were essentially, with the trees and the water and the fire, we're tapping into systems that kind of sit one layer below, if that makes sense. So there's a system which is detecting or figuring out where fire should be. And then that system is generating fire effects and also driving audio. So there's like a controller layer, if you like, which sits underneath, which is more abstract. So that's what we were tapping into most of the time.
Cool. Let's turn to dialogue. The game is a satire on this fascistic world that the game is set in. And I got to say that the scripts are just excellent. So I'm sure you had great stuff to work with there. It's this real tongue-in-cheek delivery. So, and great performances from the actors. But then the other thing that makes it work so well is it fits into the world so well. I'm just curious, what was the process to get the dialogue so seamlessly integrated into the game?
Yeah, so that's a great point, and I think it's one of the favorite things we had to work with in this game. Just like how flavorful like the dialogue was, but also fits so well into that very sarcastic tone and the satire of it. So originally, actually, the delivery and the performance direction was way more colorful. But this was redirected at some point in development. And we decided to stick a lot more with this more utilitarian and yet completely ridiculous delivery, because the effectiveness of it relies on the fact that these brainwashed soldiers do really believe in these crazy things they're saying, right? So this was what we focused on, basically just establishing the tone, using specific assets that we were using as reference, basically, in the dialogue sessions and recording sessions, not only in terms of the delivery, so the tone, because we wanted the tone to be quite consistent throughout, but also in terms of the projection levels and to be able to just keep everything as even as we could.
Super Earth, our home. Prosperity. Liberty. Hi there. Democracy. Our way of life. Oh, hello. But freedom doesn't come free. No! Sweet liberty! No! Look familiar? Scenes like these are happening all over the galaxy right now. You could be next. That is, unless you make the most important decision of your life. Prove to yourself that you have the strength and the courage to be free. Join the Helldivers.
This required a bit of testing. We didn't quite get it quite well from the get-go, so we had to do a bit of testing with that. But it did help that we had the same director throughout the entire process, and also our same colleagues over in the US, in LA, helping produce the sessions and doing the management there as well. So all of that helped with just keeping the performances quite consistent and believable. It was also a challenge in the sense that if you play the game, you know that as they become a bit more freaked out, they start to kind of lose control. And you can hear that in the dialogue itself. So we had to sort of scope that in the way that we wanted it to make sense within the context of what the player was experiencing, right? So originally we had some problems with that as well. We had to tweak the system a little bit and tune it out in terms of just how the dialogue is going to trigger in terms of states, and for it to make contextual sense in when it was happening. So sometimes they were at the beginning, they were freaking out when there was like a lot of like little tiny bugs and it didn't make a lot of sense. So we were like, no, we need them to be, when they have a big boss or like a character that was really a big enemy. So it required a bit of testing, but we got it to a point where it felt quite right. And we think that's one of the best, aspects of the game, just like how much people enjoy them completely losing control in the chaos that is, some of the battles they can be in.
So it sounds like you had time to go in and experiment and learn, which is not always the case in games when scripts come in, far too late. I'm just curious, where in development were you able to start getting that the dialogue in so that you could, test these things and find out what needed to change?
I think this was quite early on, even when we joined the project. We already had quite a bit of dialogue in there. That we could work with and test. We did create some systems for just dialogue triggering, prioritization, cooldowns, chance of playing, all of that, so that we could also not only make the dialogue play in a way that made sense for the player and gave the information that the player needed at the time that they needed it, but also to help create a more cohesive soundscape, in the sense that the lines would play in a moment that it makes sense. They also wouldn't trigger too much, that kind of thing. So it was good that we had assets to test with already at such an early point. So we started to refine the dialogue pipeline and the dialogue just tech overall, how we were going to trigger the dialogue. Because the challenge in this game is just how chaotic and out of control you can get. The more players you add, the more that adds to the complexity of it. But also how there's so many different types of intensities or different amount of enemies that you can have at any given point. So because it has so much of this sort of unknown elements to it that can change the game at a very short amount of time, we had to adapt our BO triggering system so that we could adapt it quickly as well, and in a way that not only was relevant, but also if a line, for example, at a certain point made sense, like maybe someone was giving you a compliment or something, but after a while, it probably would have triggered too late if it was queuing or something, then we would call the line out, for example, so that it wouldn't trigger at a point where people would guess, why is this playing now? So we would very carefully craft that so that it would just play when it was meant to play, basically. So yeah, we worked quite a bit with that. And in terms of scripts, they came basically all the time. As I mentioned, they came early on, and then we had to shift some of the direction and some of the flavor to this more like militaristic, utilitarian, but very sarcastic style. And so that worked quite well at the end. But yeah, the scripts were always like coming in, and I think we tried to lock them at least always like a week before the recording session, so that there was time always to check the script, make sure that actors had them on time, directors as well, and we were ready for the recording sessions.
It was obviously a bit of a journey because it's such a complex game with all these different systems. I'm curious, what did you wish you'd known at the beginning of development, what you know now as you go forward with all the additional, things that you're releasing, keeping the game going now? What lessons were learned?
I think for me personally, the importance of mixing whilst you go, which is probably common to games, but also, music, film, TV as well. But yeah, saving the mix till the full mix till the very end is for games at least, quite a challenge to iron out. So I think in hindsight, as the first time I've led a game as well, it's definitely something to consider for future titles.
I think, at least for me personally, I think it was quite a new experience in general. I was quite new to being senior, and then towards the end of the project, I got to pick up some of the lead duties as well. But like the overall, I think lesson for me is just that you don't need to know everything. You just kind commit, make decisions, and fail fast, and all those cliches, and that'll get you far.
Quick one then. I think being more rigorous with, this is very blunt, but being more rigorous with tossing away things from the project. Because this project has been around for 8 years now, and we still have things that has been there since day one. And balancing that kind of project management versus being in a live environment is something that I'm seeing and learning from right now.
I'd like to thank you. I look forward to, continuing to see what's going to come out for Helldivers 2. And thanks very much.
Cheers, Alistair.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Many thanks to Alistair and all the folks at Sony Interactive Entertainment and Arrowhead Game Studios for joining us on the podcast today. And an extra special thanks to Sony for all that great gameplay footage. Helldivers 2 is now available in Dolby Atmos on the PlayStation 5, as well as on Windows. You can find links to the game, as always, in our show notes. And if you'd like even more conversations with artists and filmmakers and video game developers and sound designers discussing the creative ways they use technology to tell their stories, be sure you are subscribed to Dolby Creator Talks. You can find links to our show on all the major podcasting platforms, including the video version on YouTube, in our show notes. Or you can simply search for Dolby wherever you get your podcasts. If you're curious to know more about what we do at Dolby Creator Lab, head on over to dolbycreatorlab.com. There you'll find information about all of our programs. You can access the entire library of episodes of the show, and you can sign up for our mailing list. Until next time, this is Dolby Creator Talks. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with additional editing by Matt Nixon. And our production coordinator is Karen Marroquin. Thanks for joining us.